Welcome to this module, a very exciting module actually. Because in this module, we will finally leave our local Git environment, so our Git projects managed locally on our machine, and bring our Git knowledge to the cloud with GitHub. So in this module, it's time to explore this new tool, this cloud tool, and this tool will allow us to, manage our projects online with lots of advantages, especially when it comes to collaborating with other people on our projects. This is again a basics module though, therefore in this module the focus is on understanding how GitHub works and how it can be connected to Git. Therefore, in this module, we will of course get started with, again, the core question here, what is GitHub actually and how can Git and GitHub be connected? We'll then also dive into additional branch types, remote branches, remote tracking branches, and local tracking branches. And whilst these might look a bit confusing at first sight, these branch types are very important to understand how this communication, this connection between Git and GitHub is established. And the knowledge we gain here will also help us to easily manage our Git projects via GitHub. And we'll also dive into concepts like upstreams, and we'll also learn how we can clone existing GitHub repositories, so Git repositories hosted on GitHub, so how we can clone these into our local Git environment. Again, lots of exciting concepts to be covered, therefore let's dive into this module. Before we can dive into GitHub here in more detail, we have to go back to the beginning of this course though, because you hopefully might remember this slide here, where we had a look at Git and where we talked about Git being a version control system, about Git being a great tool when it comes to managing code history, and where we learned that Git is great to track our code changes over time. Right now, we are aware of many of the great features Git offers. We know about repositories, about branches, about commits, and we learned a lot about the internals of Git, so how we can efficiently manage projects with the capabilities of this tool. Then we also had a look at GitHub in the first module of this course, and we learned that GitHub is the largest development platform. It is a cloud hosting and collaboration provider. And then we saw that it is made for Git repository hosting. And now again, at this stage of the course, and with the knowledge we gained, this last point especially hopefully makes a lot more sense. Because hosting Git repository shows the great connection these two separate tools have in common. Because whilst we can manage projects offline locally with Git by just taking advantage of the great capabilities Git ships with, bringing these Git projects, these local Git repositories to the cloud via GitHub, so providing these projects online, of course with the option to restricting access to a dedicated audience, but that's something that we'll cover later throughout the course. Well, this is exactly where these tools are connected now. Therefore, this module is all about how we can make this exchange between these two separate tools as efficient as possible. And of course, the module is also about understanding how this exchange of information, which it is in the end, is actually made possible. So Git is the local tool. GitHub is now our cloud provider for Git repository hosting. Therefore, as a next step, we should first have a look at how these two tools exchange information, so information about repositories, branches, and commits in theory. And then later in this module, we'll dive into the practical part. Connecting Git and GitHub. That's the idea behind this theory lecture now, and as you can also read on top of this slide, we first cover the case where we have a local repository, so basically the case that we had throughout the entire course so far, and now we want to learn how we can bring this existing local repository, including the branches and commits in this repository, to an empty so-called remote repo, remote repository, so a repository located on GitHub. Therefore, our core structure looks something like this. We have Git and we have GitHub, of course, as our cloud service provider. And on Git, we have the local repository, so the local project managed via Git. Now the goal is to make this project, this repository, available on GitHub. A project being available on GitHub does not mean by default that it's available for anybody. You can of course also define who can have access to this project. Therefore, whenever talking about bringing the project to the cloud now, first means that we have access to our own project from the cloud too, just to be clear about this at this stage. So this local repository with all the branches and commits should be brought to a remote repository, a repository we created on GitHub and which does not contain any branches or commits at this stage. To bring this local information to the cloud, we first have to establish a connection between these two different repositories. I mentioned it already throughout the course, Git and GitHub are two separate tools, so there is no default connection between these two, so Git doesn't know about GitHub and vice versa. Therefore, first we have to run a git command to kind of tell both tools that there is a remote repository and a local repository, and that we might want to exchange information or data between these two repositories. For this, we need to run a new git command locally on our machine in Git, and this command is called git remote add origin URL. This looks a bit complicated at first sight probably. The git keyword, well, is something we used throughout this course already quite often. This simply initializes a git command in the end. Remote add is something new though, and simply stands for a new remote connection, a connection to a remote repository we want to establish from our local repository here. And then origin and URL are simply the terms referring to the specific repository that we want to, well, establish the connection to. Origin here is basically the name of the remote machine, or it's also an alias or the shorthand of the URL of the remote repository. So in simple terms, the last part of this command, the URL, is, well, a unique URL to this remote repository on this remote server, and origin can then be used as a shorthand instead of this URL later whenever we want to interact or refer to this remote repository. So with this command, in the end, we simply establish the connection to this remote repository, which can be identified by a unique URL and which can be referred to later by the origin keyword. Origin here is a name that we could change, so we could use a different alias, a different shorthand for this repository. Generally, in real-world projects, and also for the purpose of this course, we'll refer to the origin keyword as the shorthand for the URL of our remote repository. With this, we have a connection between these two repositories, but now we want to bring our local information to this remote repository. For this, we will use another new git command, and this command is called git push. So we push our local data to the cloud, to GitHub. And we might also want to have information that is hosted on GitHub later, so we can also create branches in GitHub, for example. And this information might also be something that we want to have available locally in our repository. For this, we'll use the git pull command. This is of course just a high level, concept view at this whole Git and GitHub connection concept. First, we of course only covered the case where we have a local repository with data in it and where we want to bring this data to an empty remote repository in GitHub. And there is, of course, also the other case where the remote repository contains data, and this data should be made available in an empty local Git repository. This will, of course, be covered later throughout this course. And also commands like git pull involve a bit more information to be used correctly and efficiently. Nevertheless, this is how Git and GitHub can be connected in a nutshell. Therefore, to make things better accessible here, it's now time to go to GitHub to create an account and then to see how this works in practice.